In this video, we are going to take our Cloud Firestore database that we set up last time and learn how to perform the basic database operations from within our React application. So last time we learned how to set up a Cloud Firestore project. We created a users collection into which we put a few documents. Each has their own unique ID that is used to refer to that document. And then our documents have an individual user's data stored within them. So we are going to learn how to perform CRUD, or create, read, update, delete. So this is a common acronym you will encounter when learning about persistent storage mechanisms. And any persistent storage mechanism should be able to create data, read data, update existing data, and delete existing data. Of course, Firestore provides us with more nuanced operations here, but in broad strokes, these are the four categories of things that you want to do with a database. And our process for learning about each of these is going to be reading the docs, implementing a create, a read, an update, a delete in just JavaScript, and then implementing it in React. And the reason why we're doing this is it's important to read the docs so that you're not reliant on me to show you things. The docs are ultimately the source of truth about how to use Firestore. So we're going to go through the process of looking at the structure of the docs, parsing the information that's in the docs. Then we're going to implement it in JavaScript because we're trying to reduce the amount of new concepts that we're encountering at once. So if you can implement it in JavaScript, then you know that all of your logic is working for doing these CRUD operations on your Firestore database. And then once we've got that down, we can bring it into React. And then any errors that occur, we already know that it's working in regular JavaScript. So we've made a mistake if an error occurs, we've made a mistake in the React specific logic. So going through this process will help us build up our knowledge incrementally, introducing more moving pieces as we go. Because in the world of React, we're going to have a lot more moving pieces than in just the world of basic JS. And for all of this, we are going to focus in on this users collection that we started last time. Again, the kind of quiz collection, what we actually want to have in here for storing quizzes within our platform, letting users create quizzes, publish quizzes, share the quizzes with other people. All of that is a little bit too complicated as a starting point, and a users collection is a much simpler place to start thinking about our application. So you can use as a starter file the project you were working on last time. I've got that pulled up here, where in index.js we wrote our first query. We did a read query to ask the database for all the users. So you could use your code from last time, and because we're not really going to be using a ton from previous projects, you could also spin up a new Create React app for following along. The only thing you might be missing is the loading spinner and the error message. So let's start with reading data. So I'm heading to our documentation for Firestore, and then under the read page, there are a whole bunch of, or a read section, there are a whole bunch of different pages on specific topics related to reading from the database. So we'll start our journey into reading here on the Get Data Once page, which shows us a couple of things. It shows us how to get a specific document, how to get multiple documents, and how to get sub-collections within a document. So there are a few different reading operations that Firestore provides to us. And the way that these documentation pages are structured is that they often start with, here is the example data that all of the rest of the examples, the code snippets on the page use. So like here, what they're showing you is that if you wanted to run any of these examples, you need to run this code, which creates a cities collection and then inserts a bunch of documents. So here there's a document under the key SF that has been set to this data. So it has the name, the state, the country, the capital, the population, the regions. And then there's another document in here for LA, which has been set to all of this data with the name for Los Angeles, state, country, etc. So you want to keep this in mind as you're reading the rest of the snippets on the page, because those snippets are operating within this context of having a cities collection with these different cities stored in there in documents. So when we see a reference here that says to get a specific document, a single document, you ask for a collection, and from that collection, you ask for a document specifying their unique ID, and then you can get on that document reference to get a promise that resolves to this document snapshot, where you can check if that document exists, and if it does, you can print out its data. If it doesn't, you can handle that situation, and if there's an error, you can catch that error. So this is referring back to, obviously, this example where we saw the cities collection has a doc stored under this specific ID. And if we keep going down the page here, we can see that there are more options that we can specify when we are actually trying to query a specific document, like how it interacts with our cache on our that's set up inside of the Firebase library. And we can also see that when you parse data, you can actually ask Firebase to convert it to an instance of one of your custom classes in your project. So this can be useful if you're modeling something complex in terms of the data and you want to set it up with specific methods. Like if you wanted to have a quick way to serialize it to a string, you could have Firebase convert your city directly into a city instance. And we saw what we looked at last time was that we can actually, instead of just getting one document, get multiple documents, where we actually query from the collection instead of a specific document. So here we can query and specify some additional limiting information, some filtering, some sorting here with the where clause. And then you get that query, which kicks it off and gives you back a promise. And you can also get those documents, all of them, without specifying any extra filtering or sorting. And if we poke around the docs here, we can actually see under read data that there's a way to read data and get notified of real-time updates, which is incredibly useful. And there are ways to perform more complex queries. And if we click on order and limit data, we can see that there are ways that when we ask for something, we form a query, we can say, hey, please sort this by name and only give us 3 returns, or sort this by name in descending order, or give us only places where the population is greater than 100,000 and sort it by population and limit it to 2. So there's a lot of powerful querying that's built into the Firebase library in terms of when we want to read data. So I think we have enough. If we look back at our roadmap, we read the docs. So let's implement this in JavaScript, and then we'll work on implementing it in React. So last time we built our first query here, and we learned how to do it kind of the long way and how to do it the short way and how to do it with actually specifying some constraints on that query here with where. Let's write a read operation here that instead of reading all of the users, reads the data for a specific user. We'll call this read one user, and let's pass in the ID to this function. And since we're going to write some promise-based logic here, we want to make sure that we run the asynchronous logic in a try catch, and we report any errors that occur. And then for reading one user, we flip back to our docs here, get data once, and look at that first example. So db.collection gives you a collection reference. And once you have a collection reference, you can create a document reference by tacking on .doc and specifying your ID. And then once you've done that, you can ask Firebase to go actually retrieve that reference using the get method. So we're going to want to await db.collection. So this is giving us our collection reference .doc, and here's where we're going to pass in our ID. And if we throw get on here, this is going to actually kick off the asynchronous communication over the network to the database to actually retrieve that information. So that the get gives us a promise that is going to resolve to a document snapshot, or it's going to throw an error and that'll be caught down here. And this snapshot is a instance that is like what we got up here. So it has an ID property, it has a data method, and it's really handy to keep this documentation page pulled up. So this is under the reference inside of Firebase. And we, when we get a document snapshot, so we're getting this back from the database here, we can get the data, we can print out its ID, and there's also a property here, exists, which tells us whether or not that snapshot actually connected to some data that's in our database. So Firebase, when we ask for something, if we put in an ID here that doesn't exist, it's not going to error out. It is just going to return a snapshot to us that tells us it doesn't exist. So what we can do is if document snapshot exists, or sorry, if it does not exist, then let's go ahead and console log no such user found with ID. Otherwise, oh, this is, I called my variable snapshot, not doc snapshot. So if the snapshot doesn't exist, this will print out. Otherwise, we can actually say that we successfully found a user. And we can console log their ID. And we can console log the snapshots data. So this function we can use to retrieve any user provided that we know their ID. So if we want to invoke this, we need to specify an ID. So I'm going to flip back to my console here, and let's say I want to retrieve Rosa's user document. So I'm going to copy this field and paste it in here as a string. Pop open my console and see that we have our query from before still running that is looking for all the users that are online, and here's our printout for our read one user, and we can see Rosa's information being printed out here. And we can easily change that ID if we flip back and say we want to grab Amy's information. We just grab that ID and paste it in here. And now we see Amy's data printing out. And if this ID doesn't exist, like let's type in some gibberish. Refresh it here. We can see that our code is printing out that no user exists with that ID specified. All right, so at this point, we should be pretty comfortable with just in JavaScript land talking to our database to get all of the users and talking to our database to get a specific user based on their ID. So now if we look back at our roadmap, we can actually work on implementing that into React. And when we implement it in React in kind of the full version, we want to make sure that we manage the loading state, that we handle any errors, and that we kind of format and take the data that we get back here and put it onto the page rather than just dump it to the console. So that's why it's really useful to just, make sure your queries work and get valid data outside of React before you bring it into React and have to deal with all of that loading, error, display logic. So let's comment out these two functions so that they're no longer running. And I want to work on this in our demos page here that we had created before. So this is in my router here, but I believe that I've removed it from the nav. So it's still here under demos. So if I go to /demos, oh no, I have it in the nav. Never mind. In a future version, we're going to remove this from the nav. So I want to load this on this page, but we've got a whole lot of demos here that we don't really need displaying. So I'm just going to flip back to my demos page and let's comment out all of these here. And I am commenting these out one at a time because we have some comments in here already that we can't actually use the comment hotkey to comment out large chunks when we have comments embedded in here because that breaks the commenting tool. All right, a clean demo page here. And we're going to create some Firebase user demos. So throw an H2 on the page and we'll throw a bunch of stuff under this H2 in, let's create a folder here called Firebase. And we're going to need a get all users component. So this will be where we translate our read all users here. So I'm going to copy and paste this so that we have it for reference as we're working on this component. And breaking this down into small steps, because we've added something to our page and we're trying to add a new component on there, let's just get a basic get all users component rendering. So let's return an H3 says get all users and export default get all users. And then if we head back to our demos page, we should be able to import this and put this onto the page. Good. Okay, so we've got something that is imported and displaying. So now we can revise this. And actually, I want to return a div that has this H3 in it. Get all, or maybe we'll call this read all users. And to start off simply, let's have a button that you click on to read the users. So when we click on read users, we want to see in our console either an error or the users that are brought in from Firestore. So we're going to create a onClick function here that we're going to attach to our button, but we want to make sure that this is an async function because we want to do our logic that we wrote previously inside of this onClick. So I want to grab my try catch, throw it in here and uncomment it. And then I need to make sure that I'm importing the DB. So I'm going to hit Control Space to pull up the IntelliSense. And this has inserted this into a very strange spot. So I'm going to move that to the top. And this JavaScript logic, I'm actually going to select this and bubble it down to the bottom of the file by holding Alt and pressing the down arrow. This is just for reference the JS version without React. So we can always refer back to that if we're confused about how to read the users. We've got that saved in here. So this should work as long as we go to our button and we say when the button is clicked, our asynchronous onClick function should run. So if I click read all users, we can see found those 2 online users. And every time I click it, it does a new fetch and pulls them down. And it's getting the online ones because we added our where clause in the last video. So this is kind of the easiest way to take our logic into React because we are just running this database logic when the user interacts. So when a button is clicked. And that form is really easy for us to do. We're not even storing state. We're not displaying any loading information just yet. We're just running that query and dumping it to the console. So let's do the get user component as well, and then we can come back and update both of these components so that they do have the loading information and they do display something onto the page, not just to the console. So let's say let's get one user, and let's create a new function. And so that we can see something on the page, let's put a div here and an h3 get specific user. And let's import this into our demos page. Get one user, make sure that the import is up here. And good, it's loading on the page, so we should be able to work with this. So same deal, bringing our JavaScript logic in, we're going to copy this or cut it from our index, and let's paste it in at the bottom here so that we have it for reference. And for getting a specific user, we're going to need an ID. So we actually do want to start bringing in a little bit of state so that we can have an input field on the page. So let's create a piece of state called user ID. Whoops, wrong IntelliSense. This one will auto import for me. We'll set this to an empty string. Then onto the page, we need to display an input box. And previously, when we've used labels, we have used the ID to associate a label to an input. Because we're not doing a lot of styling here, I'm actually just going to do input text and remove the HTML4 and remove the name and ID. So these are automatically associated together because the input is nested within the label. If we were doing a lot more styling and we wanted to have more control, I would actually use the ID on the input and use HTML4 on the label to associate them together. because this is a more flexible thing for us to style than what I'm doing here. But again, we're trying to keep it simple and just work quickly to get something into our React application to interact with. So this is fine. So this is an input of type text. Its value is our user ID. And when there is a change event, we will take the event and use our setter and pass in e.target.value. And so this logic we've typically broken out into a named variable up here, like we would say const on input change equals e, and then set user ID. For really short ones, we can just inline them here using an anonymous arrow function. So this should be set up so that we can actually type into our input box. Let's check that here. Typing, so we should have that state. And as always, we could pop open the DevTools here and select this and see that state has actually been set. So then we just need a button to click on that actually reads the user's information. So let's say get user, and on click, we will run an on click function that we will create. And same deal, this needs to be async because we are going to run this logic that we wrote previously in read one user. So I'm going to copy the logic we wrote, uncomment this, give this a save, and we need to fix a couple of errors. So we need to make sure that we import the database from our Firebase folder. And instead of ID here, which was a parameter we passed into our function, we want to use the state variable. So we will get from the users collection anything that has that ID of user ID. And if it's not there, we'll get a little error, or we'll get a console message that says that's not there. Otherwise, we will get the information printing out to our console. So type in some gibberish, get user, and look at our console. No such user found with that ID. Good. And if we go ahead and grab Rosa's ID and paste it in here and hit get user, it's a success, and we see Rosa's information pulled down. So this is great. We have done the first step of bringing this set of read operations over into React land, but this doesn't really deal with any of the loading, error state, or put anything on the page, so it's not the most useful integration into React. So let's take a look, as the last thing we'll do in this video. We'll take a look at updating both of these components so that they actually display loading error messages, and so that they actually display some information on the page when we get it back. So let's do get specific user. So let's go back to our get one user function. And what we want to do is a really similar pattern to when we fetched from the API. So we needed previously we called it like a fetch state. In this instance, let's call it like a query state, and set query state. We will use state, and this promise, this query that we're running, we need to know if it's loading. We need to know if there's an error message. And we need the actual snapshot back. So I'm setting this up to not be loading initially, to have no error message, to have no snapshot, because we don't have anything until we actually click. And then what we want to do when we click is that before we actually initiate this, we want to set is loading to true, remove any error message that may be there from a previous query, and remove our doc snapshot data. When it resolves, we can take our snapshot, and I'm going to rename this by hitting F2. I'm going to call it doc snapshot. To make our variable name more consistent, you can see that changed it here, here, and here. And then when we store this into our state, we can just say doc snapshot rather than having to say doc snapshot : doc snapshot, because the field name is the same as our variable name. And if something goes wrong, whoops, make sure that we're taking the loading flag off. If something goes wrong down here, then we want to set is loading to false. Could not connect to database, like a generic error message. So now that we have that stored, we should be able to see it in our dev tools here. So let's grab a user ID, paste it in, and if I watch, oh, this is out of date. Here we go. Now if I watch this after I hit get user, it loaded really quickly, possibly because this was cached and wasn't doing a full network request. And then we can see our doc snapshot in there. So let's do something similar to what we did with the API. Let's create a contents variable. If, well, actually, let's destructure is loading error message doc snapshot so that we have them in variables. Is loading error message doc snapshot. This is equal to our query state. So now we can just say is loading rather than query state is loading. If it's loading, our contents should be a loading spinner. If you are not using the starter files in the quiz game, you may not have the loading spinner, so you could just put like some text in a paragraph that says loading. But since I have this from our previous API version of our project, I'm going to use that. If it's not loading and there's an error message, then let's go ahead and make the contents be an error message that displays the error message here. And I'm using, oops, keep forgetting the S for contents. I'm using the IntelliSense to pull these in as I'm typing, so make sure that if you don't, that you are importing all of those as you go. So if it's not loading, there's no error message. If the doc snapshot doesn't exist, then we could display like a paragraph that says no user found. Otherwise, we know that it exists. There's no loading state. There's no error message. So we can say that the contents are equal to, let's just put something simple on the page. So doc snapshot dot ID, like we were doing up here. And then make sure that we, whoops, no semicolon needed. We throw that conditional contents onto the page below our button. And whoops, I forgot to think about one state here. We're seeing that it tried to reach in and get the exists property of our doc snapshot, but when the page loads, we haven't tried querying for anything. So actually, we need one more check here. So if doc snapshot equals null, and we're not loading, and there's no error message, that means we haven't made a query yet. So we can just put nothing on the page. Whoops, we could use a document fragment to put nothing on the page. We could put an empty paragraph, whatever we want to be the contents when we haven't made a search, we would put here. So maybe instead of like an empty thing, let's say we'll just display something that says like, hey, you should search to see the results here. Okay, so we now have all of those handled. So let's grab one of those IDs, paste it in here, get the user, and we can see the ID printing out. And if we search for something that doesn't exist, no user found. And you can see that our loading state is kicking in here. And if we wanted to test the error state, rather than needing to like force an error through Firebase, we could just type something into our error message to see that error message popping up here. So since we have talked about custom hooks, then you'll know that I'm going to recommend that this stuff be pulled out into a custom hook so that our component can be just responsible for the user interface here of the input and the loading error message and not have to worry about any of the internal logic of how to connect to the database. Let's display a little bit more in terms of the contents, right? It's not super useful to just see the ID. So let's create a quick internal user component here. And we will pass in data to that user. So the user component will be able to return a div with the first name, the last name, whatever else we want to throw in here, whether they're online. So let's just do data dot first name space data dot last name. Give this a save, and then instead of loading our paragraph here, we will load the user component, and into that we're going to say, here's your data, doc snapshot data. Remember that the snapshot is the thing that has the ID, the exists property, and the data method. And when you call the data method, that actually gives you an object literal that has your information from your database. So we should be able to grab an ID. Let's grab Amy's here, paste it in, get user, and we can see Amy Hackett printing out. And if we wanted to get any more information, like Amy's high score, whether or not Amy's online, these topics, we could. So in this user component, we could say Amy's high score is data dot high score, and we could say actually let's do this here. So we'll have a little message that either says online or offline. and we'll use a ternary conditional to get that text display. So data.isOnline, question mark. If they are online, we'll print out online. Otherwise, we'll print out offline. Make sure there are no compile errors. And then if we flip back to our React application, it already reran our query, and we got Amy online. Amy's high score is 80. And let's grab someone who's offline. Rosa Ramirez, offline. Rosa's high score is 50. And why don't we just move this component out? And by moving the component out, we can then use that component in getAllUsers or any of our other components to actually display a user. Since it's been moved out, we need to make sure that we actually import it though. So import user from user. And our application should still be set up to work here. Grab our third user, me, and I'm online and I've got my high score. So everything's still working. Okay, so we did our error loading state here for our user. This component is done. Let's quickly look at the read all users, how to do a similar refactoring here. And a lot of the code is going to be similar. So this is going to be a signal that, later on we'll learn how to refactor this. But for now, we'll definitely need our query state. So I'm going to grab this and bring it over to get all users and import use state. And the difference between these two components, like this component, we're doing a search. So this is initiated when you click. So it starts off not loading anything. But our get all users component here, if this is like a status list of all your friends or all the users in our application, we actually want this to run its query initially when the page loads. So I'm going to start this off in the loading state. And instead of this on click, we want to use an effect, because effects were the way that we were able to run some logic, some side effect logic at different points in the React lifecycle. And if we specified an empty array here, that meant that this logic ran when our component mounted. So instead of this asynchronous function here with the try catch, we want to create a async get all users. We'll call get all users. This logic should run inside of there instead of on our on click. We can get rid of our button. And at this point, it's a good this is a good point for us to, since we made a couple of changes, just make sure that this is compiling and that this console logging is happening on mount. So there we go. It is looking for our online users. You can see it's still working, and it's happening as soon as the component is mounted to the page. Let's get rid of our where online. We can get rid of some of these comments that we had for reference before. And now we can do our set query state is loading true and make sure that we clear any errors that might be there. And you know what? As I'm looking at this, we don't want to call this doc snapshot anymore because this is multiple documents. So I'm just going to call this data. Or, you know what, let's stay with our naming convention of making everything explicit. Let's call this doc snapshots. So doc snapshots, null. After we're done here, we can say we're no longer loading, there's no error message, and throw in our snapshot. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to call this doc snapshots. so that I can just really easily put this in and match the name. And if there's an error, let's make sure that we are no longer loading and that error message will do something similar. Could not connect to database. Please try again. So with that, we should be manipulating the state. So the quick way to verify that is with our dev tools. And if I refresh the page and then look for get all users, we can see our state here. We're no longer loading, and we've got our snapshots in our state. And actually, now that I'm looking at it, I'm realizing this is not an array, because instead of storing the docs from that snapshot, we stored the actual snapshot itself. So I think what I want to do is let's rename this back to snapshot, and we'll create a new variable, doc snapshots, which is equal to snapshot.doc. Docs, like we were doing here. And this I can store into our state variable. And we can get rid of this console logging. So now if I check my state, we should see what I was hoping to see, which is get all users. Doc snapshots is an array with all of our document snapshots. So then it's just a matter of putting this on the page. Same logic as before. If we are loading, then contents should be a loading spinner. If there is an error message, contents should be an error message component with that error message as a child. Otherwise, we can actually display our users here. And let me just throw something, let's just throw a fragment in here, and let's destructure our state variables so that we have access to them. So we need our isLoading, error message, and doc snapshots from query state. So now those errors that were popping up around error message and isLoading are gone. And our contents here, we actually want to take the doc snapshots and map over them and transform them into our user component. And remember, our user component needed the doc.data passed into it for it to render properly. So we're just taking each doc, transforming it into this user so that we have it in an array in our contents, and we can just dump all of the contents onto the page. So we've got our loading state. If there were an error, the error message would be displaying here, and we have all of our users displaying on the page. Obviously, this isn't the prettiest, but this is functional. We figured out how to handle the loading and error states inside of this read all users. And it would be good to test that. So like, let's pretend that we had that error and we were saying something like, please try again. That is displaying here. And I see one warning in our console is just going back to thinking about putting lists and putting arrays on the page. You have to give each element a unique key. And because we're pulling this from our database, each document does have a unique key, which is its ID. So when we make that change, that warning should go away. And we can see those keys here. Phew, okay. So zooming back out, we talked about CRUD, create, read, update, delete. We dug deep into read. We learned how to read the docs. We learned how to implement the read operations in JS, and then we brought them over into React land and learned how to initiate them when you clicked, so when you did some kind of interaction with the page. And we also learned how to run these queries when the page loads so that you have your data immediately when the user boots up a page. We're going to cut this one off here, and what we'll do in the next video is start looking at create, update, delete.